service to that mission. The pride in this young Marine and the gratitude for his service and sacrifice was visible throughout the Laredo community. Driving through Laredo from the airport, the streets were lined with folks, including school children, holding up American flags in honor of Lance Corporal Espinoza. Veterans from across the state proudly stood outside the entrance to St. Patrick Catholic Church to pay tribute to their fallen brother. And across the street, a giant American flag hung from the ladder of two fire trucks. I attended the Mass officiated by Bishop James Tamayo and paying my respects to Lance Corporal Espinoza's family and other members of his family. There's nothing we can do to bring back Lance Corporal Espinoza, but we can ensure that his service and sacrifice and that of the other service members killed that day will never be forgotten. I join those across the country who are mourning the loss of their heroes and honoring the sacrifices they've made for our freedoms. And to me, one of the most unique things about the United States military, this is not just about our freedom. They were protecting the rights and the freedom and the dignity of people on the other side of the planet. Our nation is forever grateful to these young men and women and their loved ones who've made unfathomable sacrifices for our freedoms. Mr. President, we were back in session after a busy August, and we're hitting the ground running in the United States Senate. This week, congressional committees have heard from top Biden administrations about the disastrous withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan. In the months to come, there will be more questions about the decisions that led to the collapse of that country and how the administration plans to protect the American people from terrorist threats moving forward. You know, the whole premise of our going to Afghanistan in the first place was to deny vacuums that could be filled by terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and thus represent a threat to the homeland, not only of people in Europe and in the region, but also to the people here in the United States. Some called 9/11 2001 a failure of imagination, because we never imagined that terrorists overseas would plan and execute a terrorist attack that would kill 3,000 Americans using 2 airplanes to fly into the World Trade Center. So now, with the embarrassing and disastrous withdrawal by the Biden administration of our troops from Afghanistan, the question is, how long will it take the terrorists to reconstitute themselves and present a clear and present danger to not only the region, but also the continent of Europe and the United States? But for right now, we deserve, and the American people deserve, answers and accountability. And it's not just these 13 Marines that lost their lives in Afghanistan. Other American service members have lost their life and literally their limbs to try to deny safe haven to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I worry that they may worry that their sacrifices may have been in vain if, in fact, these terrorists occupy this vacuum which has now been created with the very hospitable Taliban, which was responsible for hosting Al-Qaeda in the first place. I worry these troops feel like their sacrifices has been in vain. But I want to assure them that they did what they were asked to do by their commander-in-chief with honor and respect and great personal sacrifice. And no matter what happens going forward, nothing will ever change the respect and the honor that we have for them in their service. We also, Mr. President, have a fast approaching government funding deadline. To be specific, we have about 16 days before we will be knee-deep in a government shutdown unless Congress appropriates money to keep the lights on. Following a year and a half of economic instability, there is no justification to unleash even more uncertainty on our economy and on hardworking American families. Then on top of that, we're told that our Democratic colleagues intend to pass a $3.5 trillion, probably closer to $5 trillion, reckless tax and spending spree bill, otherwise known as reconciliation. You know, during the last year, during the COVID-19 crisis, we worked very well together because we knew this was a national emergency that did not respect political parties or ideology or persons. And we had to do everything we could on an emergency basis to help. But that emergency is quickly getting in our rearview mirror. And our Democratic colleagues seem to be determined to continue to recklessly spend borrowed money that will have to be repaid by the next generation of Americans and to raise taxes to the highest level in recent memory, thus compounding the risk not only of inflation, which is a regressive tax on working families, when the food that they put on the table, the gasoline they buy, the appliances they buy, all are seeing prices going up at very quickly escalating levels. There is a real danger that this sort of reckless tax and spending spree will have a very negative effect, not only on them, but also on our economy more generally. For months, we know that our Democratic colleagues have been debating back and forth about how much they're willing to spend on a liberal wish list. The chairman of the Budget Committee initially floated a staggering figure of $6 trillion. Now, I never dreamed that in my lifetime, certainly in my service here in the United States Senate, I would ever vote for a $1 trillion bill. But I did during the emergency called COVID-19 because I thought it was necessary. But this kind of reckless spending is not necessary. This is an ideological juggernaut to try to achieve things to transform this country into some Western European social democracy, social welfare state. Well, after months of negotiating amongst themselves, our Democratic colleagues have now settled not on a $6 trillion figure, but on $3.5 trillion. Still a shocking number. Nonpartisan budget experts, as I indicated, say the actual cost would end up closer to $5.5 trillion. So don't be fooled by this so-called appearance of self-restraint. This plan is chock full of damaging tax hikes, permanent welfare with no work requirements, Green New Deal climate mandates, and a laundry list of socialist policies. A party line vote just before the recess laid the groundwork for the biggest government spending bonanza in American history. But now some of our Democratic Senate, House Democrats are beginning to wring their hands trying to figure out if they can justify such extreme spending and taxing. And I must say, it certainly will require some creative thinking. Trillions more in borrowing when American families are already being pummeled by inflation. A sweeping amnesty with no effort to control the growing immigration crisis at the southern border. Tax hikes on American families and small businesses. Our Democratic colleagues are proposing the most extreme policy proposals that one might imagine in this one massive bill. So getting their members on board is half the battle. But we are now seeing the internal debates and discussions among Democrats wondering if this is the wisest course of conduct. Because there's no doubt about it, this is a massive amount of money. And Democrats are going to have to raise the debt ceiling by themselves if they want to write a check that big. This is where things get a little kooky. Even though this is a partisan spending spree, our friends across the aisle expect Republicans to join them in raising the debt ceiling, claiming that this should be a bipartisan effort. But it's clear Democrats don't require Republican support. They can attach this credit increase to the tax and spending spree bill and pass it with only Democratic support. The only problem is they don't really want to own it. They want political cover. They want to help us, they want us to help them pull the pin out of the economic grenade that they're about to toss in the laps of the American people. When this reckless tax and spending spree inevitably blows up, they want to be able to blame someone else. They want plausible deniability. But it's not going to work that way. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, and folks on our side of the aisle have made it crystal clear on that point for months. If they want to spend alone, they're going to have to address the debt ceiling alone. Our Democratic colleagues can't cut Republicans out of the process when it's convenient and then beg for cooperation when they need someone else to blame. I have no doubt that our colleagues across the aisle will come up with a host of gimmicks to try and get Republicans on board. Some have suggested threatening to shut down the government or withholding critical disaster relief. To be absolutely clear, folks on our side of the aisle do not want a government shutdown. The American people and our economy are already experiencing enough pain. In my state of Texas, we've suffered enough natural disasters for me to understand how critical it is to get disaster relief out the door as quickly as possible. Communities impacted by hurricanes and wildfires do not deserve to be treated as political pawns on a chessboard. If Democrats want to charge $5.5 trillion to the taxpayer's credit card, they'll have to increase the credit limit themselves. And they can do it by themselves with the $3.5 trillion social welfare bill. And they can't treat disaster victims and government funding as hostages. Our Democratic colleagues already went on one partisan spending spree earlier this year, an additional $1.9 trillion under the guise of providing COVID relief when only about 10% of it actually addressed COVID. And that has fueled, in the opinion of people like former Democratic economists, office holders, Larry Summers, for example, who said that we are risking a growth of inflation which will raise prices on commodities and things that people need in their daily lives in order to live, and thus form an invisible tax. As it stands today, our debt is roughly 107% of our gross domestic product, $28.7 trillion and counting. Most of us can't imagine what $1 trillion is, much less $1 billion, but it's roughly $28.7 trillion. And the sad news is somebody's going to have to pay that back. Somebody. And I believe it's simply immoral for us to continue to spending borrowed money, raise the debt, and expect future generations to pick up the tab. We know at the same time families are being hammered by inflation, as I said, and small businesses are still trying to lure employees back to work. So we're not going to assist with an encore performance of the partisan spending spree that we saw earlier this year. If our Democratic colleagues believe this partisan tax and spending spree is a wise investment for the American people, they're going to have to sell it to the American people and up the credit limit on their own. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Will the senator withhold his request?
I'll request, Mr. I did not see my friend from Iowa behind me, so excuse me.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
border security is one of the government's most important responsibilities. A sovereign, successful nation's self-determination and safety depend upon it, and we're no exception. Our border security rests exclusively with the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security, a cabinet created in 2002, I believe, in the aftermath of the September 11th attack, is entrusted with this paramount duty of protecting our border. Fusing homeland with security for its name wasn't an accident. That wordage casts the department's purpose to protect the country from external threats, both from people and from products. And Americans pay for that department handsomely, and for its responsibilities about $52 billion a year. However, a grave, unprecedented crisis exists at our southern border.